Nashville, 1968, late October. The kind of night where the city felt like it belonged only to the people who built it. RCA Studio B was quiet except for the hum of equipment and the sound of Chet Atkins replaying a take he'd already listened to 11 times. The session had gone long. The other musicians had packed up an hour ago. The engineer was still there, half asleep on a stool behind the glass. But Chet didn't need him anymore. He just needed the room, the playback, and the silence between the notes. He sat with a legal pad on his knee, marking time signatures with a pencil. Not writing anything, just marking. It was a habit, something to do with his hands when his ears were working. The door opened behind him. "Mr. Atkins," his assistant said, "there's someone outside. Says he knows you." "Well, says he knows your records." Chet didn't look up. "Who is it?" "Jimi Hendrix." Chet had heard the name. Everyone had. He'd heard the stories too. The flamboyant clothes, the guitar solos that went on until the audience forgot to breathe, the Stratocaster played behind the back and with the teeth and sometimes set on fire. He'd read the reviews in the trades, the ones calling him a genius, the ones calling him a spectacle. He'd filed both away without much opinion. He wasn't dismissive exactly. He just didn't see the connection. Rock music was a different world, a different language. Chet had spent 20 years perfecting something precise, clean, architectural. He'd built a guitar style that borrowed from classical and country and blues and somehow made them sit still together. Every note placed, every phrase complete. What he'd heard of Hendrix was something else, loud, bent, distorted into shapes that made him uncomfortable in a way he couldn't fully name. "Tell him I'm still in session," Chet said. The assistant hesitated. "He's been waiting 40 minutes. Chet set the pencil down. He looked at the engineer, who had the good sense to say nothing. "5 minutes, Chet said. The young man in the hallway was quieter than Chet expected. He was wearing a wide-collared shirt, patterned, the kind of thing that would have turned heads on Music Row. But he wasn't performing. He was just standing there, hands in his pockets. And when Chet came through the door, he straightened up the way you do when you're trying to make a good impression and you're not entirely sure you're going to. "Mr. Atkins," he extended his hand. "I'm sorry to bother you." "You're not bothering me," Chet said, which wasn't quite true. "What can I do for you?" The young man paused, like he was choosing the words carefully. "I grew up on your record," he said. "My dad had a few. I used to slow them down on the turntable to figure out what you were doing with your right hand. Took me a year to understand the thumb." Chet looked at him. "I just wanted to say that," Jimmy said. "That's all." He wasn't asking for anything. He wasn't pitching a collaboration or angling for a session. He'd waited 40 minutes in a fluorescent-lit hallway to say thank you to a man who'd never heard of him. Chet shook his hand, said something polite, went back into the studio. He didn't think about it again until 3 days later. He was walking the corridor between Studio B and the smaller tracking room at the end of the hall when he heard it. Guitar, acoustic from the sound of it, and finger-picking. His fingerprinting, the pattern he'd built and refined and put on records for 2 decades. He stopped. The door was ajar. He didn't push it open. He just stood there and listened. It was his technique, no question. The thumb handling the bass, the index and middle fingers alternating on the treble strings, the way the melody sat on top of the rhythm without either one getting in the other's way. He'd spent years making that feel natural, making it sound like one hand could actually do 2 things at once. But there was something else layered inside it. Spaces, little pauses where Chet usually filled in. Not mistakes, the opposite of mistakes. Places where the silence did something, where the guitar stopped and the note kept going somehow, hanging in the air on its own weight before the next one arrived. Chet pushed the door open. Jimmy was sitting on a folding chair in the corner of an empty room, a borrowed acoustic guitar across his lap. He hadn't plugged anything in. There were no amps, no pedals, no chords, just the guitar in his hands and whatever sound the room could hold. He looked up when the door opened. His fingers went still. "I'm sorry," Jimmy said. "Someone said the room was free. I can go." "No," Chet said. "Play that again." He'd been working through Cascade, one of Chet's earliest instrumentals, a quiet thing he'd recorded in 1954, finger-picked and unhurried, the kind of piece that didn't announce itself. Most people didn't know it by name. You had to go looking for it. Jimmy played it through once, and Chet stood in the doorway and listened with his arms crossed. It was the same song, the same structure, the same key, the same general shape. But the interior had been rearranged. The bass notes landed harder. The melody seemed to drift above the rhythm instead of sitting on top of it, which should have been the same thing but wasn't. And in the spaces, those deliberate spaces, the guitar seemed to breathe. Chet uncrossed his arms. He didn't say anything when Jimmy finished. He just stood there for a moment. Then he walked into the room and pulled another folding chair from against the wall and sat down. "Where did you learn that?" he asked. "Your record," Jimmy said. "I slowed it down." "How long did it take you?" "To learn it the way you play it?" "A while. This version." He paused, looked at the guitar. "I was working it out just now." Chet heard that, and something settled in his chest that he couldn't explain. Not jealousy, not quite. Something more like vertigo. "Play it again," he said. Jimmy played it 3 more times. Each time was slightly different. Not because he was uncertain, because he was listening, testing something. He'd try a variation in the second verse and abandon it halfway through. He'd add a harmonic in the bridge that hadn't been there before and keep it. He was composing in real time, refining while performing, which was its own kind of discipline, different from the discipline Chet knew but no less serious. Chet watched his right hand, watched the thumb, watched the way the fingers didn't press harder when they wanted more sound. They just changed angle, changed approach, found the note a different way. "You taught yourself this," Chet said. "From your records, yeah." "No one showed you the hand position?" "No." "You figured it out by ear?" Jimmy nodded. Like this was a simple thing. Chet had been playing fingerstyle guitar for 25 years. He'd had teachers. He'd had records of his own to study, Doc Watson and Merle Travis, and players who'd handed down the technique through a line of careful transmission. He'd worked it until it was second nature. This young man had listened to a record, slowed it down, and found his way in on his own, and then found his way further. "What do you play at the shows?" Chet asked. He meant it as a genuine question, not a comparison. "Electric. Strat." Jimmy looked down at the borrowed acoustic. "I don't play like this up there. Different thing. But you started here." "Yeah, had to. Couldn't afford an electric for a long time." Chet thought about that, about the sequence of it, the years of acoustic work underneath everything, the foundation that nobody saw because the shows were loud and bright, and everything that Nashville told itself it wasn't. He dismissed the noise. He hadn't thought about what was underneath it. They didn't talk for a while after that. Jimmy played a few other things. Not Chet's material, just noodling, following whatever thread presented itself. It wasn't a performance. It was more like thinking out loud, the way a pianist might work through something at a piano in an empty room. Chet sat and listened and said nothing. At some point, the engineer appeared in the doorway, saw them both, and silently disappeared. Eventually, Chet picked up a guitar that was leaning against the wall. Someone had left a steel string in a corner, tuned and ready for nothing. He played a phrase, simple, testing the room. Jimmy responded, not imitating, answering. He took the phrase and did something adjacent to it, a question back. They went back and forth like that for maybe 20 minutes. It wasn't a lesson. It wasn't a jam session in the way that term usually meant. It was two people listening very carefully to each other across a significant distance and finding, here and there, a patch of common ground. When they stopped, it was because Jimmy had somewhere to be. He stood up, handed the borrowed guitar back to the wall, and picked up his jacket from the floor. "Thank you," he said, "for letting me stay." Chet nodded, watched him go. He sat in that room alone for a while after. Not doing anything, not marking time signatures. He told one person about that night, his producer, a few weeks later over dinner. He didn't tell it as a story. He mentioned it in passing, almost as a footnote. The producer said, "Did you know he's playing Madison Square Garden next month?" Chet said, and that was the end of it. 25 years later, a journalist from a guitar magazine came to interview Chet at his home in Nashville. It was 1993. Chet was in his 70s. He'd slowed down, but his hands hadn't. He played something for the journalist before they even started talking, just to show that the hand still worked. The journalist asked the standard questions: influences, technique, legacy, best sessions, favorite recordings. Near the end, he asked, "Is there a moment you keep coming back to? Something that changed how you thought about the guitar?" Chet was quiet for a moment. "There was a young man," he said. 1968, he came to find me in the studio, and he waited a long time in a hallway just to say thank you. I didn't give him much time. Later, I heard him playing in an empty room, and I stood in the doorway and listened. The journalist asked, "Who was it?" "Jimi Hendrix." The journalist looked up from his notepad. "He was playing one of my early pieces," Chet said. "Fingerstyle. He taught himself from a record, and he was playing it." He paused, looked at his own hands. "He was playing it better than I would have. Not technically. Technically, we were in the same conversation, but he'd heard something in it that I'd put there without knowing I put it there. Something I'd never found myself." "What did you do?" "I sat down and listened," Chet said. "What else do you do?" He picked up his guitar and played a phrase. Quiet, unhurried. The journalist recognized it eventually. An old instrumental, gentle and precise. "I still think about those spaces," Chet said. "The places he left empty. I'd been filling those in for 30 years. Didn't know I could stop." He didn't say anything else about it. He didn't need to. Jimi Hendrix died in September 1970. He was 27 years old. Chet Atkins outlived him by 3 decades, playing until his hands wouldn't let him anymore. In interviews across those years, he rarely spoke about the night in Studio B. When he did, he kept it short. He wasn't the kind of man who explained what something meant to him. He just played it instead.